Thank you all for joining. It's very good to see you all. We have a pretty packed program today, so we'll just start. I'm very happy to present to you Rafael, our head of managed services, and Kobe, the support engineer. Am I muted? I am muted.
That's fine. You're being transmitted from now.
Oh yes, that's correct. Okay, and we're ready to start.
All right, so screen share. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
I'm gonna hit share at the bottom. Share.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. There we go. Great. All right, everybody, thanks for coming. We are hosting this webinar about VMS on KVM within the cloud, a guided first steps. Here. This will just be a quick guided first steps guide to setting things up initially. Quick agenda, we're going to go over. The introduction is just going to talk about a bit of the context and history as to why we started this project. We're going to go into a graphical representation of the system topology we're working with. I'll give that to Rafael from that point. From there, we're going to start with creating instances within OCI, setting up OracleLinux 9 as a host, setting up KVM as your hypervisor. From there, we move on to host-guest interaction between what we just set up and VMS as the guest. After that, VMS guests specifics and just working within VMS. And that'll be it for the setup. From there, we talk about a bit about our process when it came to working with OCI and VMS and how scripting can help you achieve the most optimal results for the future and setting it up. Beyond that, we'll have time for some future plans for future sessions between me and Rafael and the rest of the team, and a quick Q&A joined by Daria, our CEO, and Camille, our Chief Product Architect at VMS.
So if you have questions, there is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Please leave them there and we'll address them in turn.
Okay. We have a lot to do here today, so let's get started. A bit about our objectives for today. So this presentation is going to show the process of instance creation and act as a reference guide for when it's time for you to try yourself. It's not going to be a full-on Linux KVM installation, because if we were to do all that, it would take us all day. We only have an hour and we don't want you guys falling asleep on us. So we're just going to get you excited and motivated to potentially try this yourself and share some of the roadblocks we ran into while setting it up. If you'd like more details about the nitty-gritty, we are going to host future sessions about networking, storage management, host snapshots and restoration. So stay tuned if you have any pressing questions you want to learn more later on. But with that, let's get started. I'm going to take it to Rafael to get us going. Oh, sorry. Just a quick history about the project. We at the professional services team, we realized that many companies are now trying to prioritize cloud solutions within their businesses. Whether that's a cloud first model, cloud only, cloud ready, we realized that here at VMS Software it was probably a great priority for us to move forward and really help you guys achieve those goals while still keeping us in your business plans. So we collaborated with CDL as a customer to create this proof of concept of getting an existing VMS customer system. From their side, replicated it, migrated to the cloud, and hopefully by next year, they will operate solely on the cloud with VMS.
All right, so let's move on now to perhaps one of the longest slides, but potentially also one of the most important, which is the topology of the system. And we have devised here, hopefully in a more didactic manner, where we're going to go stage by stage, layer by layer. So let's start with what is a bare metal machine in the cloud. So a bare metal machine in the cloud is one of the machines that is administrated by the Oracle Cloud infrastructure themselves. So they do have the possibility that you also get access to a full bare metal machine, which you as a customer administrate, but that is not the topic, that is not the scope of what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is basically a virtualized bare metal machine for which we do not have access. That bare metal machine will then have a level 0 host, which is also not managed by us, is managed by Oracle themselves, which we do not have access to. So we don't know if that is running Linux, Windows, or whatever hypervisor that may be running. That level 0 then has multiple level 1s, which we do not have knowledge of. We do not know who are running those level 1s. We do not know how many, and so on and so forth. So as part of being in a simulation, we do not know if there are other ones right there, but we assume there are. But then it comes our level 1, which then involves the OracleLinux 9, which is one of the versions we support for the Linux, the other version being Red Hat. And as we create a level 1 instance, which is then based on a shape, something we're going to talk about later, we do get directly Oracle OCI command line interface via the web, which acts as a terminal console directly to a bash prompt, which is inside the Oracle Linux 9. The creation of this level 1 also involves the automatic creation of 2 network cards. And the first network card is already configured for direct external SSH to this bash. We're going to show this in one of our live demos, how this bash is achieved, which is basically, how this SSH is achieved, which is basically with a key. Then once we have this level 1 set up and we have, gotten used to how it works and so on, we move on to the installation of KVM, which then we have, once KVM is installed, we have absolutely no guests, no images inside. And after that, we move on to the installation of the VMS guest. And VMS guest, in this case, we call a level 2. And the only reason why we call A is because you do have the opportunity of having more than one level 2. So you could have VMS level 2A, VMS level 2B, and as many as you wish. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to assume that there is only one level 2, which is what we really will call from then on guest. So just as quick recap, we do not know how many level 1s there are there, but we do know we are one of the level 1s. And from now on, we're going to call this host, which is the Oracle Linux 9. And we are running with the assumption that there is only one guest because we set up only one guest as level 2. And from now on, we're going to call that just simply guest. So things get a little bit more complicated as we start stacking more installations and configurations. So the next step is, of course, as you can see right now, we have access to the host, but we do not have yet access to the guest. And that is done by what is called a MAC-V-TAP pass-through. And hereby represented as a pipe because it is indeed a TCP pipe. And that is connected directly to the virtual network card number 2, not the number 1. And that can also, similar to the virtual card number 1, be directly accessed by SSH from an external interface. Of importance here to notice also is how the 2 network cards are actually independent. So network card is exclusively used by the host, and network card number 2 is exclusively used by the guest. Both of these virtual network cards, so that's the V in front of the network interface card, they are actually translated into a hardware layer, which we do happen to know runs on a original NVIDIA hardware within the bare metal. That's not something that you need to know, but it's just a curiosity. And then this goes into the Oracle infrastructure network, which now we represent as VCN1. So the virtual cloud network 1 is connected via one of the ports on this NVIDIA directly to our virtual network number 1. And this is automatically, this whole picture here, so basically this change here is automatically set up by Oracle as you set up the level 1 Oracle Linux 9. We're going to show that a little bit later, but just important to mention here that within this virtual cloud network, we do have a subnet which contains local public addresses and another subnet which contains private local addresses. Within the local public addresses, and it's a little bit funny when we say local public addresses because it's very easily in the range of 10.0.0. something. Those addresses are directly translated via a firewall or access rule set and an internet gateway into a public IP address, which we then use via to access the host via SSH. This is all done via the HTTP. So basically our host, Linux, so our level 1 OL9, takes the local public IP and doesn't know anything about the external public IP, but it does have the connection directly. So I'll just recap this, but now seeing from an external side, if you are at your place or at your home or your office and you want to access your host, you're going to access that directly via a given public internet IP address, which will then correlate via the gateway, going through the firewall into a very specific local public IP address, which then Oracle knows that it refers to this VNIC 1, which then you have a key login SSH and you get access to your bash. That is the main way to manage your host, whereas the console via the web is a fallback solution, particularly, for instance, if you have misconfigured a network card. It's not exactly an ILO, as you would see in some other system. It's not really a backdoor into the booting and all parts of the system, but it's quite similar to that, and therefore you can use that as a fallback solution. So very similar to the VCN1, and as we mentioned, the VNIC 1 and 2, they're fully isolated. We're going to have a VCN2. And the VCN2 will then be connected to the VNIC 2, which is connected to our VMS guest. And some of you might have noticed here a game of 7 errors. And one of the errors that we actually see is the lack of the HCP on the VCN2. And this is not an error of the graphics. It's actually a way that the Oracle network is set up. So when your network card number 2 receives a public IP, which then is internal public IP, which then correlates to an internet public IP, that is not automatically given to your network card, which is also not automatically given to your guest, regardless if that is a VMS or any other guest. So the lack of the HCP on your VCN2 means that the second IP address has to be set manually. And that's something we're going to touch a little bit later on. We do understand, of course, this system topology can be a little bit difficult to understand at first, but it's particularly interesting to highlight what we consider guests and so VMS guests and Linux host, and the fact that each has its own independent network card, and for the guests in particular, being done via passthrough. Okay, we're a lot of talking, so let's move on a little bit now into some action. And here we're going to show you a live demo on the manual creation of an instance. And just a recap, what we're actually doing now is we're creating this big red box here with the level 1 Oracle Linux 9. I'll switch now to the browser. Right. Yeah, it has updated. Okay. So I have already logged in prior to the meeting into the Oracle Cloud. This is exactly the same interface you're going to see once you get your account up and running. And on the menu on the left, the most important of them is instances, which is then will show a given list of, let's call, machines that you have for a given compartment. And compartment is pretty much acts like a folder. So you can have folders, which each folder has a machine inside it. As you can see here, we have been running a few different trials, and there is a webinar plan B in case the demo doesn't go well. But let's try to avoid that for now and click the button Create Instance. As you create instances, you, as you'd expect, can change the name, you can change the folder or the compartment where it is. You can change the placement, which is nearly translated as a geographical placement. In our case, we have just tried to restrict to Frankfurt, so you can have different domains in Frankfurt. We're not going to change that now, but it's something to consider when you're deploying a project that potentially you might even have different domains for each node on your cluster. So you could have a node on your cluster located in Europe, a node on your cluster located in US, and a node of your cluster located in Oceania for geographical resilience, for instance. But maybe that's something that doesn't matter for you, and it doesn't matter for us at this exact moment for the presentation. We're just going to move on with a very specific default domain. Then the next thing we like to highlight is the fact that Oracle Linux 8 and not version 9 is selected by default. So it's very important that as you're setting up your first image, you change to Oracle Linux 9. Will it work with 8? Yes, it will. Will it work with 7? Yes, we have tried both 7 and 8. But by selecting number 9, you are assured that the support team will be able to provide you a much better support, since this is the official supported version by VMS support team for the operating system which KVM will run on top. As mentioned before, the other version is Red Hat, but that is out of the scope of this presentation. So we select that image. Then the next thing to be selected is a shape. And a shape can be seen as a hardware or a configuration of hardware that you're going to provide for your machine. As we are running a fully virtualized hardware here, we're not running a direct bare metal. That means that we have the chance of setting up a lot more things than it would be the case if we just had the hardware. So instead of snapping new CPUs or RAM cards or other cards, we can then select here basically the manufacturer of the given shape. We can select different types of the shape. We can select CPU and RAM. So as a recommendation, we say minimum of 2 CPUs, potentially 3 or more, depending on our application. And let's go for now with only 8 GB of RAM. The burstable button allows you to increase and decrease the performance of the CPU as you go. And our recommendation is to not necessarily have burstable at the beginning, because at the very beginning of the installation, you are going to use slightly more CPU power and you're going to use more system power. So do not enable that at first. But depending on your application, it could be interesting to have that burst enable a little bit later on. You can enable a few extra things. So for instance, this is simultaneous thread, closely relating to hyper-threading. That's something you can consider enable or not. But for now, we're just going to go with the default settings. Next, for the primary VNIC, so as we shown you before, the VNIC number 1, it automatically creates the virtual cloud network. So if you remember from the diagram that we just showed, there will be those balloons on the very top right. We're not going to change any of these for now. It automatically also creates a subnet, no need to change. And here is the important part that we just mentioned before, that it automatically assigns a public internet IPv4, not IPv6 address, which then is directly automatically translated into a public internal IP in the range 10.0.0. So the main point to take from this is that it's already pre-selected, no need to change, but do make sure that this is enabled if you intend, as most customers do, to access your host via a direct public IP. Now, moving on to the SSH keys, you can upload your own. So let's say you do want to manage your own key creation and public and private and so on and so forth. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to save the private key, which is generated by Oracle and automatically. So we are downloading now the private, and the public is automatically going to be applied to that image. And I'll just click the button again so you guys can see. Basically has stated that it has started the download. The key is actually very small, so in practice it has finished. And now the key is on my browser default download folder. So be careful as you store those keys, and as you create this shape and instance, do remember to move that key out of your download folder into a safe area. Now we go into the boot volume. And from the original settings, we highly recommend you actually extend the boot volume size. The original value is 50. And on some of our deployments, we managed to get away with 70 or 80 gigabytes. But for most of our customers, we have seen that the bare minimum is 100 gigabytes. And something to keep in mind here is that this 100 gigabytes is shared between host and guest. So just the fact that you have about 100 gigabytes here does not mean at all that your VMS guest will get access to 100. In a more likely scenario, we are looking into a 70 to 60 gigabytes. So your host is probably going to eat up 30 to 40 for most deployments after you apply all the update packages and optional packages and so on. VPU is the performance of hard disk. We have a full slide on this, so I'll not mention for now, and I'll just leave untouched. There are a few things regarding encryption, but we're going to skip that for now. Live migration is also outside the scope of this presentation, and we do recommend you to do a reboot after maintenance. And let's create a machine. It takes a while to create a machine, and by a while, I mean less than 1 minute, more than 5 or 10 seconds. So you can see here now it's provisioning. So I'll just move on to the next slide, which is something also interesting. All we have shown you so far is how to manually create an instance, and the next slide is how to actually do this via script. So I will go back now to the Oracle interface. I will load the scripting console, which is called Developer Tools Cloud Shell. While the script is loading, by the way, we can always still move around a little bit. And as you can see now, the instance that I have created manually before is finally running. So it's no longer provision, it's running. It's just to show that that instance is fine. This is the public IP address. Of course, some of you guys may even try to log in there, but you don't have the key. But yeah, be my guest, give it a try. You do have the IP. The username is OPC by default. But what I will do now is reproduce these steps, but instead of from a manual perspective, I will now paste a set of commands which do pretty much the same thing. So I'll execute first the commands here. I'll explain them a little bit later. And you can see a lot of things have happened. And if we wait a little bit, this interface will now update with a new machine, which will be then instantiated here. There we go, provision. So I'll go back to slides so I can explain a little bit better what commands I executed here. As almost a standard to these slides, from now on, we are going to underline some parts that are very important for understanding, and we're going to set in bold some parts which, as you copy these examples, you do have to edit on your own setup. So the first bold part here is the OCI ID for the compartment or folder where your machine will reside. This is our hash for the professional service compartment. So of course, on your deployment, you're going to create your own folder. You're going to have your own compartment. It's important for you to provide this so Oracle knows where your machine will reside. The next important information is that before we can actually create a instance with the launch command at the very bottom, we do have to create a VCN, because when we are utilizing the scripting commands, a lot of the nice things that by doing by hand we get for free from Oracle in the sense of automatically created, they no longer are automatically created and we actually have to do manually. So as a bare minimum, when you are launching an instance via a script, you do need to create the VCN network, and within that VCN, you do need to set up at least one subnet. So this is the bare minimum 3 commands that are needed to launch an instance in OCI via the scripting. And within, of course, your VCN, you can set up your block. You don't have to. You can very well just go with the default 10.0. And you do need, though, to select an image. And we have provided here for you the OCI ID for the OracleLinux version 9, released at the end of September. There is no release at the end of October yet, but it will soon come. And as this slide ages, please do edit this bold so you do not spend as much time updating and upgrading your image once your system boots. We highly recommend you change, of course, the display name. And perhaps the most important of all these parameters, which you can fine-tune, is the number of CPUs and the number of RAM. Coming back to one of the points that Kobe has mentioned, the advantage of cloud is the fact that this is not really a bare metal, it's a virtualized machine, which means that you can very easily change these settings post creation. So you can increase and you can decrease the number of CPUs and also the available system RAM. Okay, so once again, main advantage, scaling up and down CPU and RAM, and you can even change the manufacturer of that. And you can scale the hard disk space upwards, but we do like to point out here that you cannot scale it down. So as you increase from 50 to 70 to 100 gigabytes, that's all fine, but you cannot actually go down anymore. That is mostly true. There are, of course, ways that you can then create a new boot device, move your boot to the new device, and therefore the new device has a smaller size. But within the original boot device, you cannot scale it down. This page here is a lot of tips and tricks. So this is first and foremost, be careful as you increase, so you don't regret and you cannot go back later. Another very nice tip and trick is, as you find via Google, via Stack Overflow or other means, some documentation, the Oracle command line interface has a certain version, and you can always replace that number with just the word latest, and that will always be redirected to the latest version of those command line help. Inside your instance, you can also fetch most of the OCI IDs that we mentioned. So a good example is You can fetch the instance name, you can fetch the instance ID, you can fetch the compartment ID. And this IP that we have used here is not an example, is a generic IP for all the instances that you use, which is a metadata server within Oracle that can be used to fetch that information. And we'd just like to point out here that there is a lot more to clear out to automating the command line interface, other than just creating the subnet and the VCN and the instance itself. So we highly recommend to play a little bit with the Cloud Shell once you are more familiarized with the whole Oracle environment.
And just a quick note on the hard disk transfer speeds. As Raphael mentioned before, hard disk space can be increased, but it cannot be decreased. So be sure you know the amount of space you would like to have before you start. But we've noticed that the speeds within the VMS guest for your hard disks have been close to what we've seen as promised. Thank you. If you see the throughput statistic over here, we have about 22 megs. And once we get onto the guest, we have the professional services team has found speeds of around 21 megabytes as well. So it's just about the same. The speeds being slightly lower is most likely due to the storage media not being exclusive to just us on the VMS guest. So be wary of that. We do recommend though that you change the minimum VPUs as per VUPs as per your application.
Right. So the original throughput of 22 megabytes per second is very slow for today's standards. It might be fine for your application, but there is a super high chance that it is not. And as this is one setting that you can scale up and down very easily, we highly recommend you to scale up in the beginning as you're starting and doing all sorts of file copied and restoring backup sets and applying updates and so on and so forth. So you do not waste time waiting for hard disk access. And once your system is set and done, then feel free to tune down as your application requires. We do present here also some other measurements which we have done on different VPUs, so VPU of 20, and then also to be noticed that for the Oracle Linux 9 hosts, we do have cache enabled or cache default, whereas for the VMS guest, as we set up KVM, it is with cache right through, so we follow VMS standards. All right, Oracle Linux 9 system management. This is a very quick slide. We are obviously not going to go through every single command. We are not going to have the time for that. But just to point out that Oracle Linux 9 is super similar to Red Hat. So if you had previous experience with Red Hat, you're not going to see too many differences. But even if you're like us, that you had some prior Linux experience, but not exactly Red Hat, it was still quite intuitive. Throughout this process, which we have been developing this application now for more than 3 or 4 months, we haven't found a single instance where we would actually get stuck or spend a lot of time researching something regarding the Oracle Linux 9. There are a few gotchas, and we particularly would like to highlight with the exclamation mark here what is super important. First of all is to create a new user with password for recovery if the network goes down. If you remember the top level topology, we did have a serial TTY console. And as you create the Oracle Linux 9, you do get a SSH key to access, but the default user does not have a password associated with it, which means that the default user can only be accessed via the SSH keys. Whereas via the serial TTY console, you must have a user which has to have a password. So of very, very much importance is to add in this case, we have just given an example of recovery console user with a given password that we add. And this user will not be accessible via SSH, but will be accessible via the direct TTY console. Another very important feature to enable is automatic updates. Every system manager would know that. This is not essential now, but we highly recommend to expand the host boot storage to all the way that you have allocated within the original installation, or if you have expanded the hard disk. So these commands are useful to be run on your first boot, but also every time you go and you slide the hard disk bar a little bit to the right. User escalation works as pretty much any other systems. And we did mention we are not going to talk too much about network, but here are some 4 commands which we would like to mention, in particular the number 2 here, which creates the virtual network cards in your host if you do not have them already. And this command actually contacts the metadata server of Oracle and downloads the IP and MAC address, all sort of settings. So you do not have to copy things by hand. It can actually be done automatically. Then a final trick, this is also not exclusive to Oracle Linux 9 or OCI in any shape or form. It's just a way of X-forwarding any screens that you have open in your host. As you connect to the host via SSH, you're most likely going to connect with the OPC default user, which does not have escalation on its own. So as you need to execute a few screens as super user or as just root, those screens, that user, because it's not anymore the user that you connected SSH with, those screens will no longer have access to the X pipe that sends the screen. So to do that, you actually have to copy your original authorization for the user which you use to log in SSH to the user which you're going to need to use eventually for a given escalated screen forward. If you're not going to use root, if you're not going to use sudo, and the user that you're logging by SSH is more than enough, you do not need to do this, but it's just a small tip and trick. And once again, this is nothing specific for OCI. It's quite common in other Linux hosts as well. Package management, we're not going to bore you. It's a lot of information here, but just so you guys know, it's very important to use the DNF tool. Oracle Linux 7 used to have a different tool. Oracle Linux 8 has both DNF and the previous tool, whereas Oracle Linux 9 favors the new tool. So we highly recommend you to use the new tool. It's important to add some extra repositories. They're listed here. Do an update and upgrade. These are the commands. And of particular importance is the base X, group install base X, if you want to forward any X screens. And there is no need to install a full-blown, there is no need to install a full-blown KDE or GNOME or similar desktop environment. Just the base X is enough for forwarding your screens. This will make sure that you spend actually fewer CPU cycles and less system resource and still get access to any screen forwarding. As a final note, we do have here some of the package that you need to install to be able to run KVM, and some of the recommended packages also to be able to install some of the Oracle automatic tools. So please do use this slide as a reference for later on. KVM gets installed. We are not going to spend much time here because there is a fair amount of documentation online from VSI itself on how to install VMS on KVM. It's just that we would like to point here that within professional service, we highly, highly recommend you not to install VMS within KVM via the GUI. We actually do recommend you to install via the command line interface. And the reason is very simple, because it's super easy to make a mistake. In particular, when selecting the chipset, when selecting the UEFI boot mode, when selecting, for instance, cache write-through for your disks, the size of disks, so on and so forth. So we have pasted here an example of the command we are using, but do refer to the documentation. And just a small gotcha here, the network for the version 9.2.2 or earlier is E1000 and not E1000E, as is the default for KVM. Whereas for 9.2.3, the recommended network is VirtualNet. All right, so when it comes to KVM fine-tuning, we do recommend the CLI, the command line interface, but then graphics user interface are actually very nice. It can be your friend, especially when you don't know much about the system and you're just poking around, you're like trying different settings, seeing how things are behaving or not. But they stop being your friend in the sense that not all settings are there. So we have seen perhaps maybe half of the settings are there, if you can say so, but particularly the more advanced settings, they are not available in the graphics user interface. On the other hand, many of the settings are also not available in the command line interface. And then you might ask now, all right, so if it's not in the command line interface and it's not in the graphics interface, where are the settings? So a lot of the settings, they're actually available only on the XML file that holds the setting for your machine. And here comes the big gotcha, which is do not edit this XML file directly. What you have to do instead, you have to dump, edit the file, and then re-import. And we have provided here you an example of how to change a MAC address and also a pass-through mode from VEPA to network MAC VTAP pass-through. So this is a very good example that basically we dump, edit, and then re-import the XML into the machine. The last point is about theme provisioning. We are not going to talk much about it, but it's just to have in mind that it's something thin and thick provisioning, we can also set that on KVM.
So we talked a bit about Oracle, plenty, and now we're going to move on to some of the VMS interactions after you set up the host. As much as you know, OpenVMS uses the files 11 file system family, and that contains ODS 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. ODS 2 and ODS 5 don't currently work with Linux without an external plugin. And we spent much of our time operating our VMS guest through our OL9 host without a network connection. So if you are in the same situation, you're going to have to transfer files somehow to your guest. For us, the best workaround we found was using virtual CD drives as you set them up in the host to transfer files into your guest. Since these CD-ROMs are read-only, you can't transfer files outside of your guest, but it works perfectly fine to get them inside. As Raphael went through quickly before, we're going to quickly breeze over thin provisioning, but if you noticed in his creation script earlier, he had 3 CD-ROMs. Those are for the purpose of file transferring. Moving on ahead. So a bit more when it comes to transferring files. Something you understand with the conversion from Linux to VMS is that, or a VMS file into Linux that is then going into a NVMS system, is that Linux is using the XFS file system. That is going to next go into the ISO 9660 or ODS3 file system and eventually be converted to ODS5. It's important to know this middle point in the transition, the ISO 9660 point, because much of your file names get restricted. And I put a bit of a list here, but that includes uppercase letters, numbers, underscores. Your characters must be less than 31. Your directory nesting is less than 8. Your path names are under 255 characters, and it restricts you to a single file size of under 32 bytes. If you're transferring a file and you do not use a container file within your CD-ROM, there's always a chance of corruption. So we here in Professional Services recommend you always contain the file in some way as you transfer it over. For us, we found zip in a VMS system is the best way. So with the image here, I have a -B9 tagged over here. You send that to your Linux host. Once that's within your Linux host, you then place that into your CD-ROM that you set up in your host, and that goes into your VMS guest to be read, and the files can transfer over. So moving on. So a bit more on some of the common issues we found between the host and our VMS guests. So there will be times you'll be using your guest, things will be running fine, you'll be transferring files in, and you suddenly lose access, and you're confused as to why. 99% of the time we found is that our host has run out of space, and you can check this by first checking your CPU usage and the hard disk throughput. You can also check if your VM is labeled as pause, see if you can resume it, and if it doesn't let you, you're gonna have to go into your Linux host and type a df-h, and that will allow you to verify whether you're out of space or not. Say you are, you go back on OCI, enable more, or give yourself more space, and you can continue as normal. When it comes to using the console to control your VMS guest, we also recommend, as Raphael mentioned earlier, to avoid using the GUI that's in Virt Manager. It's going to be a bit laggier than just using the direct Linux host console. And I've included a command down here that'll allow you to access that. It's much faster. But it only does allow you to use one at a time. But since it's not a SSH connection, you don't lose your session state. And if you tab out to do something else and tab back in, you won't find that any of your speeds will be altered at all. So a couple more issues we ended up finding was you're in VMS, you got everything going, and you try to mount multiple file systems. even though you set them up as individual file systems or hard disks, you'll find you'll get a mount-f duplicate file number error. And the easiest fix was just to add a /bind anytime you mount one of these hard disks and just have some sort of unique string at the end of it. It could be the volume number, it could be a name. In my example here, you see I just had bind equals scratchpad. It could be anything. Another error we ended up finding was that when we were restoring backup save sets, we would put them on the CD-ROM, move them into the VMS guest, and we'd find that they wouldn't work. Luckily, unlike other files, you can repair this within VMS with a backup /repair/list, and you just specifically label the backup save set, and that restores all the VMS attributes for it to work perfectly fine. In the case of other files, it's not this simple. So again, we recommend you zip it up in another VMS file system or hard disk and before you bring it over. On the topic of backups as well, you can't restore them directly off the CD-ROM, even though it would seem that you could. So you would run into a backup-f mount file 11 file system error. You just move it off of your CD-ROM into the guest, then do your repair, then do your restoration. Moving along. So when it comes to managing your disk usage within the console, I've just included 5 important topics here with some commands to make it easier. The direct Python window opening and to see your list of guests is done with the sudo verse commands listed here. When it comes to the final 3 commands listed, you are able to just adjust your host space. If you do run into that error that we mentioned earlier and you lose access to your guest, this is the commands you would use to enhance that space to keep you operational.
Perhaps we should put some focus also on the very last command, which so far we have shown you how to actually expand the storage on the host itself, particularly when you drag the slider to the right on the web interface of Oracle. But now we would like to show also that it is possible to expand a given backing file in your host, which corresponds to your hard disk in your guest. So this is an example on how to increase a already existing system hard disk in VMS by basically increasing the backing file in the host. So that increase of hard disk size is possible not only on the level 1, but also on the level 2.
And we're hoping to avoid talking about networking too much in this presentation, but one quick note we did have to include was that DECnet phase 4 addressing when configuring network settings for OCI causes problems. When you use DECnet phase 4 addressing, it adjusts the MAC address to have a AA appear in the front of the MAC, which within an OCI environment just blocks all of the network traffic. So you aren't able to establish that SSH connection. If you do use DECnet and you do use phase 4 addressing, I've included a command here to configure that. And once you get to the enable phase 4 addressing as a on routing circuit, you have to make sure you hit no here. Once you get that set up, you're able to set up SSH perfectly fine and continue on. So a couple more VMS slides here. We wanted to talk a bit about the workarounds for any simple issues you find. Anytime you apply a change to your VMS guest on your KVM host, you're going to see a setting will apply after a guest shutdown prompt come up. When that comes up, you do need to force a shutdown. You have a few options listed here as reboot, force reset, force off. It has to be shut down specifically to have those changes be enforced. Before you do that, you have to first send the @system:/shutdown command in your VMS guest, and then you go for the shutdown on your KVM on your Linux host. The reason this is currently working like this is because ACPI commands don't currently work in our Oracle Cloud interface on OL9 KVM for the VMS guest. We're still looking into why, but as for now, this is your best bet to be sure that changes get adjusted on your Linux host. Lastly, when it comes to VMS, we mentioned earlier how important we thought scripting would be for the setup of all aspects of this creation. When it comes to OCI, when it comes to Oracle Linux 9, when it comes to KVM. The same is true for VMS, although the scripts are much more rudimentary than we found with the OCI ones. So some simple dir creations and initializations are included here, and edityourlogin.com and restorations to include some of those bind equals unique strings flags. But most importantly, we had a refreshing disk command put in here. Anytime you add a new file to a CD-ROM, a backup to be restored, or maybe a package that you'd like to get onto your VMS guest, we found it very useful to have a script that refreshes that CD-ROM and basically dismounts and mounts it back again, just to have those changes appear as quickly as possible. So the rest of these, you can use your creativity and on making some of these, but this is the one I think much of you will find useful when setting up your VMS guest.
All right, I'll go very quick now. A small talk about the process, some theoretical perspective. And I do understand I'm preaching to the choir, but yeah, I would just like to point out the obvious sometimes. It is a lot of fun to play with some of these settings, especially in KVM, and you hit a few buttons here and there, and you change a few thresholds, and you see the direct impact on your VMS guest. But it's very important to note that you should write it down, and even better if you can write it down as scripts or as means that you can easily reproduce later. And we'd like to remind you that once the scripts are ready, do run a full official deployment. So start the whole thing from scratch, but this time, instead of having any manual steps, run from your scripts. And most likely the first time you do this, something will fail. Because as you wrote your scripts, they were basically isolated blocks. And as you put them together, something will no longer be compatible, things like that. So rinse and repeat on that step. And indeed, the last 10% of this rinse and repeat, basically the 10% of finalizing the scripts, is the part that takes the other 90% of your development time. So for sure, it's going to take longer than you imagine. But it is also our experience that you will end up reusing all the scripts a lot more than you also imagine. So it takes longer to do it, but they are more useful in the very long run, at least an order of magnitude more than you originally expected. So if you need more convincing, basically scripts are great for automation. It saves you a lot of time. They are reproducible. So the support team will love you that you're basically going to paste a 3-4 line script command, and then they can help you with any debugging. And perhaps most important from all of this, as seen from a professional service perspective, is that scripts, they are auditable, particularly if you do use a version control like Git. You write it once, you apply in the system, you do have a change, you apply the change into your scripts, and you apply to the system. And now all the system has are steps which have been self-documented via step commands. So we have reached now the end of our presentation, and we would like to ask you guys to contribute whenever you have an idea on topics for next KVM cloud session. There is a small list here of examples, but please do vote, comment, subscribe. This video will be available on YouTube, but I do believe we are sending also a survey at the end of this presentation, and we would like you guys to engage on next topics and also on the way the topics are presented. And a little bit of a commercial plug here. So get in touch with the professional services. We are a team with a lot of VMS experience, but we also have a lot of experience, and we know many of the contemporary IT tools and processes. We're here to help, really. We are here to save your time. We're here to provide you tools, help you with tools, provide you scripts, help you with your scripts, help you with automating some of your manual steps. And do use us to learn from our mistakes. We would love to share some of our processes and best practices, and leverage our attention to details. We have a fair amount of internal testing that we're doing on some of these performances, as we have shown you, just very, very tiny extract of the hard disk speeds. And we do apply quite a bit of fine tuning to some of our customers, so we are experiencing that area as well. And do use us as a way of delegating our responsibilities. So we're also capable of doing full system migration, updates, upgrades, and also 24/7 managed services, and a lot more. We are here to be a ears to your problem and help you out on whatever you can. So contact your account manager for details, and we'll be more than glad to help with any custom solution that you are needing for your system. And that was the part of the presentation. So we'd like to open up for questions.
Okay, we have a few questions. Start with the first one. Oracle free tier allows VM standard A1 shape. Can it be used instead of E5 shape?
Yes, the shape can be used, and if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Oracle free tier allows you 1 CPU and 1 GB of RAM. So it is not the fastest shape you can get, but it's definitely enough to get yourself started. Yes.
Okay. The second question is, what is the current maximum stable number of OCPUs in memory?
So for the host, it would depend on the Oracle Linux 9, but I do understand that there is a limitation on VMS, and that I would redirect to Camille. What would be the maximum number of CPUs we would recommend?
Okay, so we'll write a follow-up to this webinar and post it under the video as well. Okay, then we have a note here. Please note VCN should be pre-created before we go to create an instance. This is what you talked about.
Correct. If you're doing via scripting, if you're doing via manual steps on the web interface, Oracle does create those for you automatically and without even mentioning to you. So for scripting, yes, VCN, subnet, routing, source, yeah, VCN and subnet particularly has to be created manually before. Yes.
Yep. Then Craig is asking, had you tried to fix your DECnet issue by setting the VNIC to promiscuous mode and accept MAC changes?
The answer to your comment, Greg, is no. We have not tried setting a VNIC to promiscuous mode. That's something we could give a try and see if it adjusts and helps out.
So just a small clarification, regarding the MAC change, what we have seen is that if you do change the MAC address on that VNIC 2, you can see packets flowing out of your VNIC, but it seems that the replies are filtered out by the Oracle network. So from a perspective of a guest or a host, it looks like, yeah, everything is flowing fine. It's just that the whole rest of the world seems quiet. So that's the behavior. If you do see some behavior similar to that, then you know what to suspect.
Yeah, apparently Greg has some experience with that because he says in the chat that it's fixable. So maybe he's
that is good.
Cool.
Good to know.
seen it
Good to
before.
know.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
He's also asking, how did clustering testing go? SES within the KVM instance with multiple VMS guests in between KVM instances via clustering over IP.
Okay, I need to digest a little bit. We have not tried within the same KVM, and we do have a project now that we are starting to try within separate KVMs and separate hosts. The main advantage we see is indeed if you are running clustering with each node on a separate host. Within the same host, there may be some advantage. We at least do not see that many advantage right now compared to a separate host. But it's something we are looking into as well. If you guys are interested in that, please do leave the comments there. It's something we can tackle also on the next presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay. Have you tried to create the OpenVMS VMs directly over an HRL virtualization host?
Let's say it's in the pipeline. Yes, it's something we do have as a thought. There are a few issues we are currently. It's in the back burner. So, but I can mention some of the issues we have seen, which is within the level 1 host, which right now is OracleLinux, so that would be replaced directly by a VMS. We could not get IO MMU yet to activate, so that makes a little bit complicated some of the pass-through that may be needed for that. But it is in the back burner. It's something we have in mind for 2025 to give it a shot. Yes.
Okay. Do you plan to try applying OpenVMS as a custom image for VM instances?
Yes, and not only that, the idea is that eventually we submit one of the original images for the instance is a given Oracle Linux 9 version with a KVM and a VMS pre-set up. So yes, that is part of the idea.
Okay. Will fiber pass-through be available for KVM? I believe that is the plan for our first update, or wait a second. No, it's yes, it's our plan for June 2025. I mean, I'll let Camille edit that answer in case I misunderstood your question, but I think it's the plan. So if you look on our roadmap, it's there for June 2025. Okay. Are there differences in using OracleLinux 9.x and KVM with an on-prem server versus in an Oracle Cloud instance?
So the one difference we have seen so far was the ACPI. As we mentioned, we did not manage to get the request from the host of shutdown, reboot, etc., directly translated into the gas in OCI, but we have seen that working on-prem. There may be others, but so far that is the one that we are aware of. Yeah. And we are working on it because that one should be working. So yeah, we're looking into that.
Okay. According to the VMS release notes, thin provisioned disks are not supported. Does this mean that all the storage configured fully provisioned?
I may be wrong on this one, but I believe it's not a matter of not supported, it's not recommended. So we highly recommend the thick provisioning from the very simple aspect that if you do not have thick provisioning, your VMS gas might run out of space when it thinks it shouldn't. And it very well, I mean, we would very well agree that it really shouldn't, because from its perspective, the space should be there, and it's just going to look as a access error because the hard disk is full, but it doesn't know it's an external hard disk. So from my perspective, as I understand, it's not a matter of not supported, it's just highly recommended to use thick provisioning instead of thin provisioning. And the same would apply here as well. So in case you do enable the thick provision, which means they pre-allocate all your QCOW2 files in your host, it will not matter too much what you do on your VMS gas, that your host should not run out of space because of VMS. You may still, of course, run out of space due to other host reasons, but not VMS. So if VMS sees that a given hard disk is 30 gigabytes, it is really 30 gigabytes. It's not 30 gigabytes until someone else takes over. So we recommend the thick provision.
Okay, thank you. I came in late, so apologies if you covered this. Is a VMS cluster in the cloud supported?
Yes, that's something we are looking into right now, and I'll refer back to the last time we answered this. Leave in the comments if that's a topic that you guys would have interest, and I'd come in for the next presentation.
When you say supported, I wouldn't say that it's supported yet.
Right, good point. Good point.
This entire thing that we just showed is not supported yet. This is just our first try. We cannot possibly support it because we don't know everything about it. But this is the plan. Yes, it's going to be on the roadmap. Okay, and there was a question, I'm not sure, / comment about Proxmox in the chat. Again, I will ask Camille for more details on this, but as far as I know, we are not planning to support Proxmox yet. We have played with it, but it's not something that we're ready to offer at the moment.
I would just add, it's not the same question, but it's towards similar lines, is that you can also run OCI VMS with ESXi. So we mentioned here Oracle Linux 9 and KVM, just because it's cost, it's quite free. But it is a possibility, and OracleCloud themselves, they have a direct license with what used to be VMware, now Broadcom. So that's also another possibility if you guys are interested, particularly that type of road, so you do not have to deal with the Linux host.
Yes, and we got another question. Have you tried high performance or ultra high performance block volumes instead of standard? This could improve performance, correct?
We have not tried. Is this regarding the CPU or the hard disk drives?
I think I meant the
Because block volume, so I'm assuming the hard disk.
Yeah.
So we did play a fair bit with the VPUs, and for about every order of magnitude that you increase the throughput, so let's say from 20 to 200 megabytes and then from 200 to 2000, you add about $5 to $10 a month. So the way we see this is that it's a fairly small cost for a addition of performance. But just going back to your original question, no, we have not tried auto performance block volume. So.
I know it wasn't your planned topics for next presentations, but you know the cost of this instance that you were talking about, right?
Right. So the one we manually created now, I believe was $50 or $60 a month. But throughout all the deployments we have done, so with the customer, but then also the internal targeting different objectives of deployment, we have been within costs of between $25 to $60 a month. And I believe within that $25, $60 a month, we are covering up to about 100 gigabytes hard disk, up to about 10, 12 gigabytes of RAM, and up to 3 or 4 cores. Of course, as you mix and match, costs are going to go up or down, but that sort of range you're looking into, $30 to $60 for these fairly simple machines. And then if you need more cores, more RAM, then we'll go above that.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour and we also don't have any more questions. But if you guys have questions, send them to us, leave them under the video that we'll publish on YouTube. We'll answer them. And generally, if you have more to say, please reach out to us and we will respond. We will also send out a follow-up with the recording and all of the questions that have been answered so far and Camille's comments. And thank you so much for coming, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.